Terry Eagleton's discussion of character oscillates between two related points, both of which Eagleton links to the etymology of the word character itself. The first of these has to do with the fact that character is also a synonym for letter, reminding us that literary characters are not real people, but rather literary devices, or, as Iser or Fish might put the matter, literary events. In this sense, Eagleton says, we can appreciate the importance of literary types as opposed to finely drawn individuals. However, in its original Greek sense, a character was a stamp that made a permanent impression, reminding us that character can also be a synonym for identity, the network of qualities that give some consistency and reality to human persons. Both of these approaches to character are valuable to hold before us in the literature classroom, but for almost contradictory reasons. Eagleton's emphasis on the literary constructiveness of characters points to the important ways that such constructions have changed over time. As he points out, the most prevalent view of literary character amongst the 21st century reading public is still based on models of Victorian and Edwardian realism, in which an abundance of details about main characters are supposed to make those characters, in Eagleton's words, both richly individuated and well-rounded. But this approach to character is far from universal, especially across time. Beowulf, Chaucer's Knight, and Pope's Abelard and Eloise might all be set alongside Joyce's Stephen Dedalus, T.S. Eliot's Gerontion, and Beckett's Vladimir and Estragon as examples of affected or shallow characters. But that's only because we expect them to be portrayed in the same way as more realistic characters. That's a good distinction for readers to remember as they encounter works from a diversity of traditions and time periods. In a similar fashion, Eagleton's appeal to the textuality of character usefully reminds us to base observations about those characters on direct evidence, without getting too caught up in our imagined constructs of what the characters might be like. But here, as in his first chapter, Eagleton gets a little carried away and in the process seems to want to eliminate one of the interpretive activities that makes reading fiction both engaging and pleasurable, that is, imagining what characters are doing off-page. Eagleton's approach to the connection between characters, identity, values, and agency is even more vexed in part because he's so enmeshed in his own Marxist suspicion of the call to enjoy vicarious experiences and to learn empathy through reading literature. His overall discussion is quite valuable, in that it provides good examples for how readers, even the most inexperienced, might find in the literatures of other places and times a sense of the full variety of moral and personal attitudes that make up human societies. He points to the changing sexual mores of England, for example, as he talks about his own developing understanding of Thomas Hardy's Jude the Obscure. But Eagleton wants us to actively discourage other readers, including our students, from getting too emotionally caught up in the fiction we read, lest we become too sentimental and even envious of people whose lives might be different, and in many ways more exciting, than our own. From a purely Marxist perspective, that use of fiction is deadening to the revolutionary potential of the working classes who, after all, are most in need of the empowerment that fiction has to offer. Yet that argument itself runs the risk of being elitist. It does entail telling large numbers of people that they're reading the wrong way, and it fails to acknowledge, I think, the often complex, ironic, and contradictory ways in which people read their favorite kinds of fiction and engage with their favorite characters. While Stanley Fish's theory of effective stylistics may not have the complexity of Wolfgang Iser's reception theories or the breadth of Terry Eagleton's approach to cultural materialism, his ideas have nevertheless remained relevant for nearly 40 years now, in part because of their audacity. In Literature and the Reader, Fish attempts to combine old-fashioned close reading with the insights of contemporary linguistics in ways that echo some of the weirder branches of post-structuralism, even as he tries to maintain a typically American openness that is simultaneously democratic and elitist. At the core of Fish's argument is his assertion that the literary text itself is not an inert thing, but an experience that the reader will have. He even goes so far as to identify literature as a kinetic, that is, moving art form comparable to dance, certain forms of sculpture, and cinema. In this way, Fish wants to set himself apart from the tradition of new criticism that was still predominant in America in the 1970s, a tradition that emphasized reading the text on the page and uncovering how the mechanism of the literary artifact created meaning. Indeed, Fish wanted to abandon, or at least bracket, that interpretive question of meaning, and instead ask what the literary text did to its reader as an active influence upon them. This talk of the experience of the text may well sound similar to Iser's theory, which imagines the fictive text to be an event that crosses and recrosses the boundaries between the real and the imaginary. But whereas Iser seemed more interested in categorizing what kinds of events fictive texts could be, Fish seems content to acknowledge that the number of possible reading experiences is indeterminately large, and therefore one does best to focus on the contingent nature of individual texts and their particular effects upon readers. This helps to explain why, in spite of his opposition to the new critics, Fish's essay is filled with readings of particular texts, whereas Iser constantly gestures toward, but only rarely reads, any texts. A recurring criticism of Fish's theory of reader response is that it refers not to the response of actual readers, but of Fish's highly abstract, informed, or competent reader. The implication seems to be that when Fish talks about the reader, he's really talking about a very small class of readers like himself who have the education and discernment to engage in close reading. In fairness to Fish, when he speaks of a competent reader, he's making an analogy to the well-established notion of competence from the field of linguistics, where it is used to describe the continuum of speakers who are capable of communicating in a given language. However, linguistic competence is a category that really relies on empirical observation to determine, and that is a move that Fish expressly avoids. Reader response does not, in fact, involve going out and surveying populations of readers. So he's left with intuitive, subjective readings of utterances which, in practice, do embody many of the beliefs and predilections of an educated white American. But as long as one keeps in mind that potential for cultural prejudices to seep into readings, Fish's approach offers some fruitful ideas for the literature classroom. This is especially true insofar as his approach simultaneously seeks to involve students more personally and more fully in texts, even as it asks them to be more systematic and attentive in how they read those texts.